The sound of a tired heart. Amina had become invisible in her own life. Each morning, long before the cock crowed, she slipped out of bed and moved like smoke, silent, almost ghost-like. Her husband, Jata, lay snoring on the bamboo mat behind her, reeking of palm wine and sweat. The bruises from the night before still pulsed on her arms, a cruel reminder of the love she had once dreamed of, now long dead. The sun hadn't yet touched the sky, but the village of Loka was already waking. Chickens clucked. Pots clanged. Women muttered as they lit fires for breakfast. Amina moved to her sewing corner, a patched wooden bench beside the window of her mud-walled home, and threaded her worn needle. It was the only thing that still made her feel real. Stitch by stitch, she sewed clothes for other people's lives, wedding gowns, naming ceremony wrappers, burial dresses. Life and death passed through her fingers while she, somehow, remained in limbo. She was only 25, but her eyes held a sadness older than the hills that watched over the village. People in Loka whispered behind her back. That one. She used to be beautiful. How can someone live like that with Jata? She should have left years ago. But where would she go? Her parents had died in a road accident when she was 18, leaving her with no siblings, no land, and no bride price to call her own. Jata had married her out of pity, or so he always reminded her, and soon after, the pity turned into possession. Every beat, every insult, every broken plate was a way of reminding her that she belonged to no one but him. On the other side of the village, a dusty pickup truck pulled up near the old mango tree. Out stepped a tall, broad-shouldered man in a gray kaftan, his eyes shaded by grief. Malik had returned. The village had heard of his tragedy. His wife and baby had died during childbirth in the city 3 years ago. Since then, no one had seen him. But the pull of home had finally grown too strong. The scent of red earth, the calls of the bush birds, and the memory of his grandmother's singing had tugged at his soul until he could no longer resist. That he wasn't the same boy who had once chased goats barefoot through these fields. Life had aged him. Pain had carved new lines into his once handsome face. Malik walked slowly toward the home he had inherited, his late uncle's abandoned compound. Overgrown with weeds and covered in cobwebs, it was more ruin than shelter. But it was his. And he needed to rebuild, not just the house, but himself. As he passed through the market square, his eyes locked briefly with Amina's. She was returning from the stream, a basin balanced expertly on her head, her eyes hidden beneath a faded scarf. It was 1 second. Just one. But it was enough. Amina looked away quickly. She had learned not to hold the gaze of men. It brought trouble. Yet something in Malik's eyes, something gentle, something broken, lingered in her thoughts long after he disappeared down the path. That night, Jata returned drunk and angry, as usual. He accused her of stealing his coin, of oversalting the soup, of breathing too loudly. The slap came before she could speak. She didn't cry anymore. Crying only made him worse, but as she lay curled on the floor, she thought of the stranger in gray. The way his eyes didn't demand or take. The way they seemed to carry a story as heavy as her own. She didn't know his name. He didn't know hers, but something had shifted, and for the first time in years, Amina fell asleep with a question instead of a wound, what if? The unspoken bond. The next time Amina saw him, it was raining. A fine drizzle had swept over Loka, turning the dust into red mud and coating the village roofs in a soft shimmer. Amina stood beneath the market shed, waiting for the rain to ease, a small bundle of wrappers under her arm. She'd just delivered a finished dress to Mama Uduak, who paid her half of what was owed. As usual, Malik was there too, arms crossed, staring at the road. A sack of yam flour sat at his feet. She noticed his trousers were splattered with mud, his kaftan damp at the edges. That he glanced at her, then away. Then back. "I think the rain is teasing us," he said, his voice low and warm. Amina smiled faintly but said nothing. "I'm Malik," he added. "I've just moved back. My uncle used to live down the southern edge." She knew. Everyone knew. But she appreciated that he introduced himself. "Amina," she replied softly. A pause. The rain grew heavier, thunder rumbling in the distance like a restless god. Malik shifted on his feet. "You sew?" She nodded. "Mostly for women. But I can do men's too." "Good. I'll need clothes once I clear that jungle I now call home." He smiled, and for a moment, it reached his eyes. For the first time in years, Amina laughed. It was brief, almost uncertain, like a child testing new shoes, but real. Malik noticed. He didn't say anything more, and neither did she. But when the rain softened, and they both turned to leave, he called after her, "Amina." She looked back. "You have kind eyes." She froze. No one had said anything kind to her in so long. She almost forgot what it felt like. Later that night, Jata didn't come home. Word spread that he'd been arrested for brawling in the neighboring town. Amina, for once, felt the weight of his absence like fresh air. The following week, Malik brought a torn tunic to her home. "I warned you it was a jungle," he joked, holding up the cloth. She took it, their fingers brushing slightly. A shiver shot through her, unexpected. He sat on the bench outside her hut, watching her mend the fabric in practiced silence. The ease between them was strange, but comforting. There were no questions, no judgments, just the soft sound of thread slipping through cloth. "You don't talk much," he said after a while. "I used to. Life quieted me." He nodded slowly. "Same." He told her about his wife, about the baby who never took a breath, about the days in the city that felt like years. She didn't interrupt. Her silence gave his pain space. In return, she offered pieces of her own story, not all, just enough. The early death of her parents, the forced marriage, the hands that bruised her. "I survived," she said simply. "They met more often after that. Sometimes over torn clothes. Sometimes over shared silence. Sometimes with no reason at all." The village began to murmur, "Amina is talking to the widower too much. He's not from here anymore. She should be careful. A man like that won't want a woman like her." But Amina didn't care. For the first time in her life, she felt seen. Not as a wife, not as a burden, not as a tragedy, but as herself. One evening, Malik brought her a gift, a new spool of bright blue thread. "For your talent," he said. She stared at it, speechless. No one had gifted her anything in years. Her hands trembled as she accepted it. Their eyes met. The silence between them wasn't empty anymore, it was full. Full of possibility, of aching truths, of questions neither of them dared ask, but neither said the words that hovered in the air. "Not yet," because sometimes, when hearts have been broken too many times, even love tiptoes in like. When the rain fell without warning, the sky over Malacco village was the kind of gray that warned of quiet tears and sudden storms. It was planting season, and the earth smelled of promise, moist, forgiving, and alive. Women sang softly as they tilled the land, their voices rising like the morning mist, threading through trees and waking birds perched lazily on branches. Among them was Mbalanel. She moved with grace, even with her calloused feet and worn-out dress. Her hands were not made for the softness of love, but for work, real work. Yet her eyes still held dreams. Eyes that had once believed in laughter shared beneath mango trees, in touches that lingered, in promises made with whispers. That was before he left Thabiso. He had come from the city during the holidays, sent to stay with his grandmother after what he vaguely called university stress. With his clean sneakers, pressed shirts, and phone that glowed like magic, he had been the talk of the village. Every girl noticed him, but he noticed Mbalanel. He said she reminded him of silence, the beautiful kind. The kind that was peaceful, not empty. They met when she brought his grandmother a pot of boiled cassava. She had not meant to linger, but he had asked questions, gentle ones. She answered shyly, then smiled. His laugh was easy, like water over smooth stones. In the weeks that followed, they met often. Sometimes they just sat, watching goats grazing, their shoulders barely touching. Sometimes he read to her from his university books, using big words and then laughing when she made up meanings for them. And sometimes, they kissed behind her father's granary, where old maize bags sat like forgotten elders. He said her lips were softer than the music of Johannesburg's jazz clubs. She didn't know what jazz was, but she liked the way he said it. Then the rain came. It was the last evening of December. The sky rumbled in warning, but the villagers, tired and festive, danced anyway. Mbalanel wore a borrowed dress that clung to her gently. Thabiso had taken her hand and pulled her away from the crowd to the mango grove. They lay on the dry leaves, hearts beating faster than the storm approaching. Under that tree, he whispered that he loved her. That when he returned to the city, he'd write, he'd call, he'd return. That one day, he'd take her with him, show her the big lights, teach her to wear heels and eat food with forks and knives, and then, before the rain fell in full, he was gone. The next morning, his grandmother said he'd left on a night bus. Urgent call from his mother, apparently. No note. No call. No goodbye. Just the fading scent of his cologne on the old wool sweater he had once draped over her shoulders. 3 months passed. The silence between them stretched like the long dusty road that led out of Morocco. The whispers began when her stomach refused to lie flat anymore. Her mother noticed first, then the neighbor who sold cassava, then everyone. Mbalanel is with child, they said. She trapped him, others whispered. She wanted a city man. Shame, a few sighed. So young, so gentle. Her father, a strict man of old rules and few words, stood outside the house for hours that evening. When he finally entered, he looked at her belly and said only, "You will not shame me twice. You may stay, but don't call me Baba." Mbalanel didn't cry. Her tears had dried like clothes forgotten on the line, stiff and sunburnt. Instead, she walked to the backyard and lay under the same tree where she had once been kissed. She whispered to the earth, "I will grow, even if he forgot to water me." Life became a rhythm of survival. She rose before dawn, fetched water, cleaned, cooked, and helped her mother on the farm. Her father said nothing to her but scolded her younger siblings twice as much. At night, she lay on her mat, her hands resting gently on her swelling belly, humming lullabies she half remembered from childhood. Once, in the market, she saw a boy with sneakers just like the Biso's. Her heart leapt, her breath caught. But when the boy turned, it wasn't him. Just another stranger who wouldn't look twice at a village girl with dust on her feet and disappointment in her eyes. Still, she didn't hate him, she couldn't, she had loved him sincerely, without asking for anything in return but honesty. Maybe he was scared. Maybe he meant to write but life got in the way. Maybe he thought the village was just a story, and she a chapter that could be closed, but her chapter wasn't closed. It had just begun. One day, as she washed clothes by the river, an old woman sat beside her. "Your belly is round like the moon," the woman said. Balinal nodded. "First child?" Another nod. "Girl, don't let the pain make your heart hard. You are still light. Let it stay." That night, Balinal stared at the stars and tried to believe the old woman's words. Her child kicked. She placed her palm on her stomach and whispered, "You will be more than a mistake. You are my beginning." The wind answered her with a soft breeze, and for the first time in weeks, Balinal smiled, small, but real. The girl he left in the rain. Carrying more than a child, the baby came quietly, as if he didn't want to disturb the morning birds. It was the end of July, and the harmattan winds had begun whispering through the trees, bringing with them the scent of dust and dry promises. Balinal had labored alone at first, kneeling on a mat woven by her grandmother. Her mother, strong and calm, had come in only when the time was right. "You can do this," she said, holding her daughter's hand, pressing her own strength into it. Balinal didn't scream. She bit down on her bottom lip and pushed as though she was pushing her sorrow out with the child. When the cry finally came, high-pitched and alive, she felt something inside her burst and settle all at once. A boy. The women in the room smiled. Her mother wrapped the baby tightly in a blue cloth and handed him to her. "He has your eyes," her mother whispered. Balinal looked into her son's face, and her own heart softened like soaked maize meal. His tiny hands, his mouth that puckered as if remembering the world he'd left, everything about him was sacred. She named him Lutho, meaning something out of nothing. But the world wasn't always kind to names. The village didn't celebrate Lutho's birth. There were no drums, no ululations, no gifts from a proud father. Only the quiet rustle of judgment, neighbors who stared too long, women who clucked their tongues, children who pointed. Yet Balinal walked through it all with her baby on her back and her chin held steady. She tied him tightly with a faded cloth and carried him as though he were royalty. Every morning, she kissed his forehead and whispered, "You are mine, and I am yours. That's enough." She began sewing clothes, small tunics, skirts, and tiny shirts, using scraps from the tailor's leftover fabrics. Her mother taught her to stitch straight and strong, and soon, people began to notice the neatness of her work. Orders trickled in. Slowly, she earned enough to buy Lutho powdered milk and soap. Each coin felt like dignity restored. Her father, though still silent, began leaving firewood outside her room. Once, he mended her sewing stool without being asked. And on a morning when Lutho was running a fever, he handed her herbs wrapped in a dry leaf without a word. It was his way. In the city, far away from village dust and silence, the Biso sat in a clinic room staring at a file he couldn't read. He had become a doctor like his parents wanted, but he hadn't become the man he once promised to be. Not the man who had held Balinal's hands under the mango tree. Not the boy who had whispered forever under the stars. He hadn't written. At first, out of confusion. later out of shame. Then out of cowardice. He had returned to campus, buried himself in books, parties, internships. He had tried forgetting. It almost worked, until one day, he passed a shop window and saw a dress, yellow with tiny red flowers. Just like the one Balinal wore the night of the village festival. The memory hit him like a wave, sudden and cold. He sat on the curb and wept, his tears soaking the collar of his starched shirt. He thought of going back, of calling. But what would he say? I left because I was scared, I didn't know what love meant, I forgot who I was when I left you. Still, the guilt stayed. Like dust on his shoes that wouldn't wipe off. 2 years passed, Lutho learned to walk, then to run. His laughter was the kind that shook leaves and made the air sweeter. He called his mother Mama, and loved playing with spools of thread and pieces of cloth. Sometimes, he'd wrap a tiny cloth around his waist and declare, I am sewing like Mama. Balinal would laugh and hold him close. Her heart had grown gentler. Not healed, but steady. She didn't speak of Thabiso. Not to her son. Not even to her mother. Some names, once broken, echoed too loudly. One morning, she took Lutho to the village health post for his routine checkup. The nurse smiled as she checked his heartbeat. He's strong, she said. Bright too. He'll grow into a fine man. Balinal nodded, pride warming her chest. On the way back, they passed the mango tree, the one that held both her joy and her heartbreak. She paused. Lutho looked up at her. Why you stop, Mama? Just remembering, baby, she said softly. They kept walking. A letter came to the village chief 3 weeks later. It was from the regional health department. A city team would be visiting Malacco for a health outreach program, checkups, medicines, vaccinations. The chief made the announcement at the community gathering. On the day they arrived, the whole village gathered at the square. Women in bright wrappers, men in faded trousers, children with wide eyes.